Good evening. We are going to be covering quite a bit of material tonight. We're going to look at about 20 years worth of information recorded in the Bible, covering several chapters in the book of Genesis to get through basically the larger portion of the story of Jacob. Now, at his mother's insistence, Jacob leaves to find a wife. Isaac and Rebekah did not want him to take a wife from the land in which they dwelled. They wanted him to take a wife from the land of her homeland. And in Genesis 28, verse 1, Isaac is told, you need to go, you need to leave. Not Isaac, rather. Jacob is told, you need to go and you need to leave. Now we need to remember that this is exactly what Abraham refused to allow Isaac to do. In Genesis 24, verse 6, Abraham made his servant swear, do not take my son with you. Leave him here. He doesn't go back. And that should be a warning to the difficulty that Jacob's going to have. But at this time, along with the reality that there is problems with the women surrounding Isaac and Rebekah, and we see Esau has taken a wife and they don't particularly like her. Esau also hates his brother. In Genesis 27 verse 41, we're told that Esau hated him to the point that when he is finished mourning his father because his father's life was near the end, that he's going to kill his own brother because Jacob has stolen both his birthright and the gift of being the firstborn. So that is the backdrop for what we find causing Jacob to go on this journey. And it's a journey that basically begins with lies and deception. It's not easy. And see, in Genesis 29, starting through verse 14 through 20, we see that he has made it to this promised, this land. He's made it to his mother's homeland. He meets Laban. He meets Rachel. He's going to, realize, hey, I'm working for him. I've been staying there for a little while. And he says, you know what? I'd like to marry Rachel. In verse 18 we read, now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. He makes a deal. He goes, I will work for you for 7 years. This was the custom back then. You provided service. You provided wealth. You bought your bride. That's kind of the idea of what was going on here. In some cultures, there is a dowry that the wife's parents give to the groom. Here in this culture, the husband basically pays the bride price for his wife. So he goes into agreement with Laban and he says, I love Rachel. I will work for you for 7 years. I'll serve you 7 years and then we can go through and I will marry Rachel. That's the promise. But starting in Genesis 29, starting in verse 21, we see that Laban has other ideas. Leah, Rachel's older sister, the custom is that the older sister must be married first. Whether Laban was just unwilling to chance getting stuck with her, whether Laban was really looking out for Leah, we're not really sure, but he deceives Jacob. 7 years has passed. Jacob says, hey, I'm ready. I want my wife. And in verse 23, we read, now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And it came to pass, verse 25, in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this that you've done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? So Laban answers in verse 26, Laban said, it must not be done so in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. You catch the irony of Laban honoring the firstborn custom, the very custom that Jacob stole from Esau? Well, as we study this, and we're going to study a lot, you're going to notice that everything that Jacob did, all of the deception that Jacob used to trick Esau, all of the rituals, everything that Jacob did is going to come back and haunt him, basically. And while the Bible never directly tells us that this is God punishing Jacob for what he does, it is apparently clear that Jacob is going to be punished for the lies and the deception that he used to take what belonged to his brother rightfully. So Laban says, "You fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve me still another 7 years." Laban goes, "Yeah, I tricked you. That's how our country works. You're married now. I'll go ahead and let you have Rachel, but you're going to serve me for another 7 years. 14 years of service guaranteed for his 2 wives. And once he gets them, there's going to be a lot of infighting. Those are not going to be a smooth 7 years in which he works for Laban. We often ask the question, why would Solomon marry so many women? We say he has to be nuts. Jacob got more than he was bargaining for. You see, Rachel and Leah, they are very jealous of each other. And there is constant infighting in Jacob's house. Leah starts off in verse 32. She said, "Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, 'The Lord has surely looked upon my affliction. Therefore my husband will love me.'" You see, Jacob loved Rachel, and Leah sees that. She knows what took place. She knows how he was tricked. She knows how he resents her for it. And God looked upon her. He opened up her womb, we're told. And she had children. And she starts off saying, "See, God's listened to me. Now my husband's going to love me, and it's going to upset Rachel." In fact, starting in verse 30, and starting in chapter 30, we get this long thing where Rachel looks that she has no children. So Rachel envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" So she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go to her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I may also have children by her." Does this sound familiar? How well did that work for Sarah and Abraham? How well did it work for Ishmael? Resentment builds. After this, in verses 19 through 13, Leah sees what's done. She goes, "Well, if you're going to do that, then I'm going to give you my maid." And suddenly, Jacob has 4 wives, basically. And it gets to the point that in Genesis 30, verse 14, that Rachel makes a bad deal. Ironically, she makes the same deal that Esau makes. In verse 14, "Now Reuben," this is the son of Leah, "Now Reuben went in the days of his wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, 'Please give me some of your son's mandrakes.' And they strike out a bargain. Now, superstitiously in this world, mandrakes were supposed to increase fertility. That's why she wants them. That's the purpose of seeking these mandrakes. She wants to increase her own fertility. Remember that at this point, Rachel has only had the one child. Well, she hasn't even had a child yet. She's still barren. She'll have Joseph after this shortly. But she makes a deal, and because of the deal, Leah goes to Jacob and says, I've bought you this night. You belong to me. And she conceives that very night. The infighting between these two sisters, the infighting that they then drag Jacob into, makes for a very difficult time. Lies, deception, fighting. Jacob has a difficult 7 years. And that's already on top of serving for 7 years. Working. And as we continue to read, we realize that those first 7 years were not that great to begin with. So he has gone now for 14 years. 14 years plus. I'm going to see that he's going to have hard work ahead of him. But God's going to bless him. In Genesis chapter 30, starting in verse 25 through 43, we see that Jacob says, I'm going to leave. He goes to Laban and he says, look, it's time. I need to return home. Let me take my wife. Let me take my children. Let me take what belongs to me and I'll go. And they talk and they discuss and they go, well, how are we going to do this? And Jacob says, well, I'll do this. And Laban says, well, I'll do that. He says, look, I need to leave. Verse 25. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place, to my own country. And Laban goes, wait, hold on. In verse 27, Laban said to him, please stay. If I found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. You see, for those 14 years that he was there, everything he touched was prospering. And Laban says, I can see the difference. I've become a wealthy and a rich man because God is with you, and through you I've been prospering. So he says, please stay. So they start working out a deal, and finally, Jacob says, here's what we'll do. I will take all the speckled and the spotted goats. Simple as that. I'll take the speckled and the spotted ones, the ones that no one really wanted, the ones that would have been considered of lesser value. You know, I don't really understand that. It's the same way today. A cow, if it's spotted, it won't sell good. I guarantee you, the meat tastes just the same, so I don't know what the problem is. But apparently, back then, it was exactly the same. The spotted and the speckled ones were considered of lesser value. And Jacob says, I will take them. And Laban rightfully, jumps up to it. Starting in verse 35, so he removed that day the male goats and that were speckled and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and the brown ones among the lambs. And he gave them into the hands of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. So Laban says, sure, he jumps at it. Laban says, well, if that's what you want to do, that's great, we'll do it. And then to ensure that he gets the best part of the deal here, he takes all the speckled, all the spotted ones, he takes them out of his flock. He goes, okay, these are yours. My sons will take care of them. And he puts 3 days journey between his flocks that, guess what? Jacob is still having to tend to, still having to provide for, still having to work with. He puts 3 days journey between his own flocks and now Jacob's flocks. And he tells Jacob, my sons will deal with yours. Don't worry about it. We understand that he does even more. In chapter 31, we'll get to it in a little bit, but yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not allow him to hurt me. As he continues on, he says, if the speckled ones were producing, he goes, okay, you can have the speckled ones. If the solid ones were producing, he goes, okay, you can have the solid ones. Jacob's wages were changed 10 times, he said. And is this an exaggeration? Is it a literal number? We don't know. But the point is that Laban dealt deceitfully with him over and over and over. And we can see this even here. As he says, will you just let my sons and you work with mine? Because guess what? God's with him. That's the whole point. That's the whole reason of him having to stay longer. It's because God's with him, according to verse 27 of chapter 30. God is with him, and Laban wants him to stay. Then Jacob does something, after all this is settled, Jacob does something odd. And, I've read commentaries, I've looked it up, I've tried to figure it out. No one knows. Some say that it's superstition. And we have to understand that Jacob is in an idolatrous region. I disregard this idea. Others say it was some scientific method that they had, some scientific approach. I think there could be some truth to that. Others say that it was a God-given command, but the Bible just doesn't tell us that. But Jacob takes some sticks, and he puts them in front of these animals as they are getting ready to conceive. And he changes it up. He does it a certain way, then he does it a different way. And every time it doesn't matter if it's two solid animals. Somehow they throw a speckled and spotted baby. And the Bible tells us that doing this, in verse 43, thus the man, that being Jacob, became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, camels and donkeys. Whatever he was doing, and we understand that as he tells us later, it was God blessing him, it was God with him. Laban says it, Jacob says it. God blessed the method he used to ensure that his wealth grew. Well, naturally, that's going to cause some problems. So we suddenly see a very fearful departure. You see, Laban's sons start talking. And they say, hey, this man's taking everything that belongs to our fathers. And then by extension, you go, this man's taking everything that's going to come to us. They get worried, they get mad. Jacob hears about it. Jacob heard the words of Laban's son saying Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all his wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as it was before. Then said the Lord to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. God says, get out of there. Jacob realizes things aren't good for him anymore. Now it's clear there's no lost love between Jacob and his wives with the in-laws. Even his wives have problems. In verses 4 through 16, Jacob calls together Rachel and Leah, and he says, look, here's what's happening. Here's what's going on. This is what your father's done to me. And they say, well, he sold us into slavery. Basically, we have nothing. We belong to you. You do whatever God tells you to do, they say. However, things are not going to go smoothly. You see, Rachel, she steals her father's idols. She might talk a good talk. She might say, follow God, listen to God. But in verse 19 we read, now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. I've seen a lot of people talk about this. Some go, oh, well, she wasn't trying to steal them for religious. These would have been gold and silver. She was trying to steal the wealth. But the reality is, we'll read later on, that Jacob has to tell his whole household, you get rid of the idols that you have. So his household was very idolatrous. He had not done what was necessary to bring his children up. He had not done what was necessary to bring his servants and his wives to the Lord. When we talk about the trouble that Israel has with idolatry, it's interesting to see that even before there is a Israel, even before there is a mighty nation, that their roots are deeply tied to idolatry. That the children of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, would have been familiar with and accustomed to idolatry worship, to idol worship. So she steals from her father. In verses 22 through 23 of chapter 31, Laban is told on the third day that Jacob has fled. Then he took his brethren with him, and he pursued him for 7 days' journey. He overtook them in the mountains of Gilead. But God had come to Laban, the Syrian, in a dream by night, and said to him, "Be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad." Despite everything, this would have been a bloodbath. Laban even goes so far as to say, look, I have the opportunity, the rights, I have the power to hurt you. He goes at him with his brethren, with the full force that he has. He is ready to strike him down, and God stops him and says, you be careful what you do here. Even with everything that Jacob has endured, we see that a constant presence of God protecting and taking care of him and helping him. So there's a long discussion. Again, we are not being able to cover everything. But Laban demands to know who stole his household items. Jacob tells, you search my camp. And Rachel, not only has she stolen, but then she lies. She adds more deception to it. Her father comes to her and she is sitting down and he's telling everybody, get out of the tent, I'm searching it. And she goes, oh, well, I can't. I'm indisposed. And her father looks at her and goes, okay. And she steals his household idols, lies, and brings disgrace upon Jacob. Now, she's never caught here. And a lot of people go, well, see, she lied to Jacob and she gets away. She lies to Jacob. She lies to her father. She gets away with it. But I want us to understand something. Before this, Rachel has a fairly prominent role. You see her talked about pretty often. You see Jacob discussing things with her. You see a relationship between them. At this point, after this, the Bible writes her out of the story. She's mentioned once or twice with the meeting with Esau, where she's given the order in which she will stay in the camp. And then she's mentioned again at her death, when she dies in childbirth. God might not directly punish her, but the Bible writes her out. And God wrote the Bible. We see God's judgment on her. We see the change in attitude towards her. God knows what we do. Even if we hide it from man, even if we hide it from those close to us, God knows. But Jacob is now on his way home. We see that he's not only having a fearful departure, he's leaving in fear, but getting home is not going to be any better. He has a fearful homecoming. The 32nd and 33rd chapter of Genesis detail Jacob's coming home, and he's scared. Remember, Esau wanted him dead. When Jacob left, we need to remember that Esau desired to kill him, and it's been 20 years, according to Jacob at this point. But he has no clue how Esau is going to respond. It's been 20 years, and he hasn't talked to Esau. He doesn't know anything about Esau. He doesn't know how things are going. He doesn't know about any of it. So he sends a message. In 32, verse 3 through 8, we read, Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, and he commanded them, saying, "Speak thus to my lord Esau." You see how he's responding, how he's treating him, my lord Esau. "Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen and donkeys, flocks, male and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight." Then the messenger returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you with 400 men." Esau is going to come out and greet him, and he's going to come out with 400 men. So Jacob's terrified. Jacob was greatly afraid, we read, and was distressed. And he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 companies. This is where we read of how he puts some of his family in the front, some of his in the back. He divides them up because if one's attacked, the other can leave. We read that Esau says, if Esau comes to one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape. At this time in verse 20, we read that he also sends a large present. He goes, "I'll try to, buy favor with him. I'll send this large present to my brother." He's scared. But as we've mentioned over and over, despite everything, God is with him. And in a very interesting parallel, his return is very similar to the prodigal son. Read what happens. Chapter 33, verses 1 through 5. Now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 maidservants, and he put the maidservants and their children in front, Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. Then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him, and wept. And he lifted his eyes and saw the women and the children, and said, "Who are these with you?" So he said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Jacob was expecting to be attacked. Jacob was expecting to become a slave. And instead, his brother runs, falls upon him, embraces him. And you see that parallel to the prodigal son? A son who's gone off ashamed, gone off and done what he shouldn't have done. Coming home to be embraced. Jacob is welcomed home. Jacob's journey, despite how long it was, despite how difficult, 20 years. Despite everything he went through, it ends on a very positive note. In chapter 33, starting in verse 18, we read, "Then Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Paddan Aram, and he pitched his tent before the city. And he bought the parcel of land where he had pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Then he erected an altar there, and he called it El Elohi Israel." Literally translated, that is God, the God of Israel. Thus ends Jacob's journey. What does this mean for us? We have several chapters. Why does God include all this information? Now, I get including a bit about Jacob's wife, how he got his wives. I understand why he would include a little bit about, the journey home. But why include so much detail? We started in chapter 29. We made it all the way to chapter 33 now. Why so much information about Jacob's difficult journey? Well, there's quite a few lessons we can learn from here. For one, we learn that God, and ultimately we learn that God is with his children. Throughout all this journey, throughout all the difficulties, through everything that Jacob endured, God's with him. And it's a difficult journey. It's a difficult time that he endures. But we also learn that patterns of mistakes and sins are repeated. We need to be careful with this one. The mistakes of Sarah, the mistakes of Abraham are repeated by their grandchildren. We've already seen how Isaac had the exact same sin of his father. Oh, she's my sister, not my wife. Well, here Jacob, his wife deceived him as he deceived others. He suffered for what he endured, for what he has done. The patterns and the sins are always brought home. Ultimately, what we realize is that despite not having a clear and precise "you have sinned," God does punish those who do wrong. God's providence is such that for 20 years, Jacob labored and suffered. And why? Because he stole what rightfully belonged to his brother. That's why he had to flee. That's why he had to leave. That's why he's so terrified coming home, because he stole what he knew belonged to his brother. God saw it, and through the providence of God, we see that he suffers himself for 20 years. There's a lot we can learn from these accounts. There's a reason we study them. It reminds us that God is watching, that he sees, and he will both protect us, yes, but also deal with our sin. This evening, God is still watching. He knows what we're doing. He sees, and he will write it down. I think we often forget about the reality that there is a book in which God writes down that which we have done, that the deeds of our life will be brought up and laid out before us, and that we will see what we have done. God keeps a record. What will your record say? You know, Jacob is going to have to look at his life. He's going to have to see, I did wrong here, I did wrong here. I see where Rachel did this. I should have been in charge of that. What will we look at and see, well, I did wrong there, I did wrong here. But you know the greatest thing? The thing that's wonderful about us? We live in a time in which Christ has come to this world and has died for us. And Christ will be right there with us. And as we are looking through that book, he'll go, Father, I've been there. I've dealt with that. I understand. They are mine. This evening, if you were here and you realize that you haven't lived your life in such a way that Christ will be able to say, you're mine, then I encourage you, fix it. Those who are in this room, we're all children of God. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ. But perhaps somewhere along the way you stumbled, you've fallen off the course. Then I plead with you, I encourage you, please. Repent of that which you've done. Turn to God. Because God is watching. If there's anything we can do for you, now's the time as we stand and as we sing.
There's a fountain free just for you and me. Let us stay.